What I'll be talking about today, I'll introduce you, the first topic will be to introduce you to the basic theory of ethics so that you can actually understand how to make decisions on what's appropriate behavior for people. And my experience is that I'm a professor, and I'm also actually the chief editor of a journal. So I'll talk a little bit about how you perform science, what the responsibility of scientists and engineers are, which hopefully you guys are going to be going out there, and how you should behave in those jobs. That will help you hopefully one day. And the second topic is I'm actually on the board of a public company, solar cell company, called Canadian Solar. It's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And I'll talk a bit about companies. You're going to hopefully get jobs working in Russian companies or international companies, how you should think about, or how companies think about what they should be doing in terms of ethics. And so I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of that in the third topic. Okay? So that topic's called corporate social responsibility. The second topic is about social responsibility of engineers. And the first one is some basic ideas. All right. Oh, actually, I can do it with this thing, can't I? All right. So first topic is the theory of ethics. All right. So it starts with this idea that we're all alone, walking around in prehistory, not as a society, but as individuals. And Thomas Hobbes, very famous philosopher in the Leviathan, said, solitary human existence without any agreements between people is solitary. It's alone. We're alone in life. It's poor. We don't actually have a very good high standard of living. It's nasty. It's brutish. Tend to get killed quite frequently, etc. So people have, since a long time, decided that they should cooperate, they should work together. And why do they do that? They do that because it provides benefits, all right? So, for example, even the cave dwellers or prehistory people, they wanted to get food, and alone, it's very difficult to track these big animals and so forth. And also, they themselves are in the way of harm. They can be risked because they can be attacked by other people and so forth. So the two principles of cooperation were to provide benefits so that they could live, and to provide another type of benefit, which is a negative, or to minimize a negative benefit, which is harm. Okay? In modern society, those two ideas were brought together by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract, 1762. He formalized those ideas, and he called that a social contract. The idea that we, as a society, the interpersonal relationships, how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, how we deal with each other, should follow those first two ideas. That is, that we agree to surrender, to give away some of our freedoms in exchange for protection of the remaining rights. Right? We don't just give them away for nothing. We agree that we're going to cooperate with society so we get something back. Okay? And that means we create a political community. It's called a civil society. Right? It's effectively what we're doing. Right? And it doesn't have to be a country. It could be a group of people like engineers. It could be a corporation, which is a group, and it decides how it's going to work within itself or within corporations. So in this diagram, you have it here. You have the idea that there's this two-way thing, right? We're giving away something to society, and we're getting something back from society. And in the middle of it, and this is the critical point, in the middle of it is this thing here, which is actually justice. Right? And we're going to come back to that. What is justice? Justice comes from the Latin word justia, or just, being just. Justia means equal. It means that all people will treat each other equally. They're not going to, the relationship of one to another should be uniform across society, from which we get all our ideas about discrimination. You shouldn't discriminate, etc., etc. That's why when you see pictures of the scales of justice, you see the lady has her eyes covered. Justice is blind. It shouldn't matter who we're talking about, which relationship in the society, right? So the balance between what we give away and what we get back should be the same for everybody. Okay, that's a very central principle of ethics. All right, so what's the big picture? Why are we doing this? So the social contract is based on having acceptable moral, ethical, and legal norms. We really haven't explained those words, and I'll talk about them shortly. And if we have, and ethics, as we're going to see, describes what is acceptable behavior based on these standards that we all agree on, which is basically the upper arrow versus the lower arrow in the previous diagram. What is acceptable behavior to define what we mean by a civil society? So civilization is about the magnitude of the arrows going back and forth. That's what we mean. Okay? All right. So any questions to this point? Everybody okay? It's very simple ideas, but they'll, hopefully we'll build them up quickly. All right. So, we need to have an understanding of what are the norms. What's a standard? What's a norm for behavior? Okay? All right. So let's just summarize where we are at this point. We've said that, we didn't say this, but I should say this, that human beings are sentient creatures. Sentient means thinking. What does that mean? They're rational. Rational means they can reason, they can make choices. So human beings, we're talking about the choices that human beings make in terms of their behaviors to other human beings. Okay, they have free will, they can do what they like, they can make a choice. Right? So there are three things to think about here in terms of what the human beings can do. Firstly, morals, which are the generally accepted principles of what is right and what is wrong. Then, based on those principles, we act, right? And ethics is about the behavior or the actions we can take, we agree we're allowed to take with respect to one another to create, if you like, our society. And then we have, and these are unwritten laws. This is not something which is usually written down, although for societies you have codes of conduct. So, for example, professional engineers have a code of conduct. If you're doing research on biology, you have a code of conduct, all right? But generally speaking, the writing part comes under C, which is the limit of ethics is where we really put our foot down and say, just in case you didn't understand me, we have laws. And that is the limit of behavior that we allow in society. And it's written and it's acted upon. So if you break the law, there's a consequence, right? So it's enforced, it's binding, which means each member of society agrees that this is absolutely unacceptable at the limits of that point. And if you break it, then there are binding codes which tell you about what the consequences are. Okay? And whether we're talking about a full society, which means Russia, we're talking about the Society of Professional Engineers, or we're talking about a company, I call those micro-societies, it doesn't really make any difference. All right. So now I've taken the figure that I just showed you earlier a little step further. Okay? So the first point is we are individuals, which means there's autonomy. Autonomy means that we can act however we like, right? We can, but what we agree is acceptable is another story. But we should have autonomy. We should have the right to choose something. And there are certain things within autonomy, which is that we should have the right to the truth. Why should we have the right to the truth? Why do you think we should have the right to the truth, anybody? Well, if we're a society where things are reciprocal, what I do, I get, then we desire that we should do good, because if we don't, then we don't get good back. All right? Effectively, it's very selfish, the idea of reciprocity. So that's why we don't want harm. If we had this thing at the bottom, non-maleficence, that means do no harm. Latin says, I think I put it in here. No, I didn't put it. Yes, I did. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Because if you agree that it's acceptable to do harm, then harm can be done to you. We don't want that, right? So that's one very simple principle. That's like the negative one. And the positive is we like to have good done. So things like humanity and temperance, be nice to others, show respect for others, and so forth, means that they will do that for us, right? So we want, this is the plus side, it's a minus side. We want a minus minus, which is the plus, okay, here. And the last thing I talked about, justia, justice, just a few minutes ago, we want justice, right? We want there to be, we don't want someone to say, because, I've got red hair or something, I'm going to treat you differently if I had blue hair or something, right? We don't want that. It doesn't help anybody, right? So justice means that when we've decided on the values of our society, we'll equitably apportion from there. Okay, so is everybody clear? So far so good? We good? All right. Let me know if you'd like me to go back over any concepts, because we're going to build on these. All right, so just again, there are a few things that we really feel are fundamental. And these are rights, all right? And I'm going to come back to those rights. We have a right. We feel in humanity we have a right to the truth, that people shouldn't tell lies. We have a right to privacy, that what's mine I can keep as mine. So public and private property, so to speak, right? A right to no harm, and that can be harm all the way from, I agree you shouldn't kill someone, right? You won't take away my life, to it could mean I won't do damage. And there's many ways of doing damage to someone. You can kind of think about what the word damage means. And the last one, a right to what is agreed. So what do you think, in law, what do you think that means? Anybody? No? All right, I'll give you... The question was, in law, when I write the last one here, I said a right to what is agreed. Do you know what that's the basis of in law? Contract. Contract. Contract means that, you know, if I sell you something, like in fact, it's the basis of trade. If I say this, I'm offering you this for sale, and you say I accept it, that's a contract, right? Offer and sale. If someone offers you a job, and we'll come back to that later, and you accept it, that's a contract. It's an obligation to fulfill that relationship, right? That's fundamental, actually, to human existence, is a right to what is agreed. Just as a right to the truth, you'll see, is later. Right? So these things sound very esoteric. They sound very flashy, but actually they're things that are in our nature that we cannot operate. And the point is, you want an efficient operating society. That's what this is about. It's actually about managing society so it runs well. So it's not actually about what you might think, which is about being nice people, although that actually is exactly what we want, and it creates this situation. Okay? All right, so when we get to, so that kind of gets me to what we might think of as moral norms, right? Remember I said that morals are the principles upon which we all agree, and the ethics is the behaviors then that follow from that, the acceptable behavior. So if we look at the morals are the things which define right from wrong, okay? And I don't mean right as in good person, right as in what we think is the right way we should go on. So for example, courage is an interesting one because you think it sounds a bit strange. A colleague of mine, Joe, I was in his talk actually on ethics, and he was talking about a case of essentially fraud. And the person that revealed this fraud to basically the world did it at considerable cost, or could have been, and it was actually considerable cost to their career. That's actually having courage. And you know, courage can take many forms. It means really having the guts to stand up. And in companies, they call it whistleblowing, right? So typically, you may be very, very difficult. It sounds easy, but it may be very difficult to step up. And if it's a simple thing like someone's expense account is padded and you know it, it may be not. It may be very low risk. But some things are very high risk and require actually courage. Then you've got things like humanity and temperance, the idea that we should actually treat other people nicely. Now, they're pretty fundamental ideas. The fairness issue is this issue of justice, right? And you can have direct justice, which is over here, right? Which is essentially the idea of having a respect for the system itself, as well as the weights that the system attributes to various decisions. The other one here, which is very important, is wisdom. And you know, as people who will practice some trade or whatever, almost we'll see later, a fundamental idea is that when you do something, you should do it well. And the more knowledge you have, the more confidence society has in you. So having knowledge and judgment. Judgment comes from knowledge in some sense in this case, because if you know enough, then you can make a good judgment, right? Is really fundamental. The ones down here are obvious. You know, you shouldn't do things like maim someone, etc. All right, and damage property. All right, so that's enough of that. So let me talk now about the ethics. And there are three, from ancient times to kind of modern, there are three ways of defining ethical behavior, acceptable behavior, based on those principles. Okay? All right, so the three ideas are here: virtue ethics, duty ethics, and utilitarian. And the first one, which comes from Aristotle, and I'll talk about that shortly, is really about being the better self, as people might say. It's called Eudaimonia. If you were to say it, and that diagram I showed you earlier with the arrows moving back and forth, was basically from the U.S. Declaration of Independence and so forth, which effectively said, what is the driving force for all these arrows? And the driving force for all those arrows is actually kind of self-fulfillment or happiness. People call that happiness, right? So virtue ethics is really about maximizing the self, which is becoming as happy as you can possibly be. Second one, duty ethics, which comes from Kant, Emmanuel Kant, is really nothing to do with how we feel, but it's what our responsibilities are in that big picture to society. Okay? Which means we have a duty, or deontology is the kind of word that's used there. So we act on the moral rights, which I've just kind of spoken about what the rights are, things like right to the truth, etc., right to a good contract. We act on those, but under something called the categorical imperative, which is that we expect what we do to apply to everybody. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Last one is utilitarianism, which comes from people like Hobbes and Milne and so forth, which is the idea of the perspective from society on the individual. Right? So society cares about what is the best result for society, what's the best utility. So whatever action we take, what results in the best good for society or the least bad. Okay, so we want to maximize utility. So this one is, if you like, the first one is selfish for the individual, this one's selfish for society, and this one is talking about, what it is, your obligations. It's the relationship between the individual and society. Everybody kind of clear on those ideas? All right, I'm trying to keep it kind of high level. All right, so here are the Ogizas, and we'll start with the first one, which is virtue ethics, which, as I said, the major proponent is Aristotle. There's some other gits involved in this. And the focus is eudaimonia, this happiness idea, flourishing, human flourishing. And his idea, which is kind of really interesting, and it kind of makes some sense, and it's back to what I said about the wisdom piece, is that a good person, right, will do a good job, or someone who knows a lot will be able to do better than someone who doesn't know as much, right? So a good man and a good job, and doing a good job makes you a better man, so how he put it, would make you move along this chain to eudaimonia, make you more and more enlightened, and therefore you could, in the end, be the best person you could be. It's sort of like, rather like modern ideas about finding yourself and all that kind of silly stuff people talk about. All right, so, and professionalism, the modern idea of professionalism comes straight from that idea, right? That you're kind of responsible to yourself first and then society next, that you really have to do the best you can do and take a pride in your work, et cetera, right? All right, so any questions? We all good? Everyone happy? No clarification? Good. All right. I'm not going to go through these, but you can map what Aristotle thought with the list of virtues I spoke about earlier, so no need for me to waste time on that. All right, number 2, Emmanuel Kant. Here's a little picture of the fellow who looked very studious and spent a lot of time looking like that, I guess. Had a nice velvet jacket. Anyway, all right, so our friend Emmanuel Kant, he felt that the actions of the individual were key, and not so much about the consequences, but really you had, as an individual, to really follow your duty. And we'll talk about what those important duties are in terms of rights in a second. Okay? And obviously, there can be a conflict, and with all of these things, there can be a conflict with your virtues in terms of a situation you may face. There can be a conflict with your duties also. And rule ethics, if you look at deontology, Kant's ideas apply all over the place, right? So you can think about, if someone was religious, they'd say the religious commandments actually could be seen, in it, for whatever religion you're looking at, could be seen as a type of rule, right? A deontology. You could think about in a corporation, GAP, general accounting, general rules for accounting practices, and so forth. Or you could look at, for example, I don't know, traffic rules for people, how they go on the road. All these rules are basically telling you how to behave, and you don't really have much choice in some sense of the word. Things about these rule ethics is they should be very clear, they should be absolute, they shouldn't be confusing, they should be fair, treat everybody the same, and so forth. Okay? All right. The last one is utilitarianism that I spoke about earlier, and there's, again, a whole bunch of proponents in this space, from Bentham, Mill, Singer, and Hobbes. And the right action is for society, is the one that is good for the most people, for example. So, you have an election or something, people say they vote, effectively it's like that most people have got their choice, but there's some people who didn't, right? So the benefits are for the majority, can harm the minority in some sense. They don't get their choice, and you could think about actions in the same way. All right, so with utilitarian ethics, it's about maximizing the utility, the good versus the bad. A little consideration, if you like, for minority view. I think we've said that. All right, so here are the basic ideas. I don't want to dwell on it. I don't want to keep repeating myself. But basically, these ideas tell us about what are acceptable norms for behavior. All right. Now, that's all very well and good, but people would like to know, how do I use these things? These sound very abstract, right? How do I use them? You need to generate a mechanism where you can make decisions in a rational way, because that's what we are. We're rational, sentient human beings, as I said earlier, with free will. So we have to make decisions in cases of ethics. And so what I'm doing here is I've distilled what I said earlier into ethical tests, right? So you see if you pass it, you look at a course of action, and you decide, does that pass an ethical test? So from the three theories come three ethical tests, and we're going to apply them at the end to a couple of examples I've got and see if we can figure out if that makes sense, right? All right, so the first test is called the Generalization Test. This comes out of Kant's deontology or duty ethics. And remember, the principles from Kant were that every person has an ethical duty, a duty to follow ethical rules, and they want these rules to be applied universally. And in particular, what are these ideas? Well, they're rights. And if you went back to the original figure with the arrows flowing, you saw that the kind of rights we're talking about are things like right to truth, right to privacy, right to no harm, right to what is agreed. Right? So we can explore and we can say, well, are we satisfying those particular things? And are we being consistent that if we applied that to every person in this situation or whatever, that in fact it would satisfy this generalization test? That's why it's called generalization. The second is utilitarianism. So we look for maximizing utility, and that's very straightforward, right? As long as we understand what the metric is for utility. Is it, for example, that everybody should get, I don't know, the most sandwiches or something? I don't know. Whatever it is we decide is the thing we're going to measure. We want to make sure that we get the best benefit for everybody involved. Last one, in virtue ethics, we said it's about fulfillment, about the individual, but really what we're talking about is three pieces of it when we focus on making a decision. Right? The three pieces are common good. What's good for me should be good for all. Right? And what kind of things are common good? So if you're looking at an example of a company or something like that, you might think, well, is it polluting the environment? That's not good for everybody. Or it might be something like healthcare. Are we balancing a benefit everywhere in society? That's a public good. Safety. Right? Protection, if you like, against various things. A legal system that applies to everybody. These are public goods. Justice. Are we administering everything in an equitable way? Are we making sure that everybody gets the same access to whatever it is we're looking at? Or are we giving a preference to somebody? And integrity. So who knows where the word integrity comes from? Maybe not. In mathematics, what's integer? What's an integer? It's a whole number, right? Complete number, sorry, whole number. So the idea of integrity is that we want to make sure that we feel okay with the decision, which means basically, back to the virtues, that we don't sort of go against one of the virtues, which is who we are. Right? So the idea is we would feel that we'd lost integrity if we had a conflict with one of our virtues. Right? So integrity, people should feel integrity. And you can say someone's really got integrity. You've heard that expression, I hope, somewhere. All right, so that's the virtue ethics test, how we break it down. And with those 3 tests, you can start to make decisions about ethical examples. Now, to finish this little section off, we've spoken, remember I kind of talked about the moral standards. We've spoken about morals, which are the principles. We've talked about applying the principles to behavior, which I just did, and it came up with the 3 tests. And the question is, where's the limit to where we can make decisions? And the limit is the law, or these policies or whatever, formal standards, which are not socially recognized approaches, but actually it's enforceable standards. So, and the law we know should be universal, the law should be understandable. We all know what the law is, so I don't think I'm going to waste time on that. There are standards, and we've spoken about those. All right, so let me just, sorry, this thing kind of, there it is, good. This figure should hopefully capture that final piece. So there's how we are as individuals, which is the personal standard. But then there's the important piece, which is the social standard, which is how we behave to keep a stable and functioning society, how we agree we should behave. Okay? And then there's just a legal standard, which is the limit of that behavior. So society operates at the boundary between ethics and the law. And that's this piece in the middle here, where we have ethical and legal behavior. Right? So the reason I just mentioned law is because really that is this boundary here, which tells us effectively how far we can go with our decisions. Okay? So that's like the big picture. Is everybody okay with that? We've kind of effectively done a big zoom through the theory of ethics here. All right. So the second thing I want to talk about is, as engineers and scientists, we're going to talk about what our responsibilities are as individuals to society based on this kind of idea of ethics. And then the last topic will be the corporate social responsibility, right? All right. So in order to set the scene for this, if you think about, say, engineers as this example now, as engineers, you live within society. And we would like, if you're engineers, that society would think that the behavior within this group, the subgroup, micro-society, is ethical. And that means that society will look in, the big society, and it would say, you know, these people follow their rules, they police themselves nicely. If there's a problem that someone's behaving wrongly, you know, like they, for example, commit fraud or something, or they do harm to somebody, well, they would actually have remedies for that and deal with it, right? So what I'm showing you here is a couple of polls, right? Polls, you know, where the public has been involved and have given data on how well they think that groups are performing in their opinion in terms of adhering to ethical behavior. So I start here with, this is the Ray Morgan survey of different professions. And it really relates, they call it ethics and honesty. So they've picked a particular virtue, if you like, right? What you see here, and I grouped it, so you can see, first of all, you've got a scale from 0 to 100%, right? So on this scale, nurses at the top of this thing here, the public think nurses are the most ethically behaving people. And, you know, they're 6% off the top, and which means they're 4% unethical. And who is 4% unethical? Sorry, 4% ethical and 96% unethical are people like car salesmen, okay, on the other end of the scale, in their opinion, okay, the public's opinion. So why, you might ask, right? I mean, so if you look at what I did to kind of give us a bit of insight into why people, you know, what are they doing wrong or what are they doing right? The people at top, what are they doing right? What are these people doing wrong? To give us an idea about what is the expectation of society in terms of behavior. We see that the blue, which I put in here, all these people are sort of like healthcare professionals. Nurses, doctors, dentists. And what do they have in common? What are healthcare professionals? What do the public think they have in common? They think that they act for the benefit of others. Remember I said beneficence, which is like this giving to society. Well, they're very strong on that axis. And people believe that basically their motivation is to help people. Yes, of course they get a living wage and so forth, right? So they highly rate them because they feel they're being beneficent, which is one of those very strong ethical groups. If you were to take all the things I put together, they'd come together under a loop, right? And if you look at one of these things, and not doing harm to others? Well, you know, if you look at, for example, accountants and directors of public company and business executives, well, generally speaking, the public don't have very much to do with those people. They're kind of a little bit aside. So there's a kind of neutral sense there. Although if you looked at the grouping, which is kind of interesting, I took some labels. So accountants are responsible for, in public companies, they're responsible for making sure that, for something called auditing, which is that there's actually a proper way that things are reported and you follow the rules. So actually, they say that people who follow the rules are the most ethical people, right? The business executives, the ones that make the decisions and manage things, they're not so sure about them, right? So that's kind of what they're saying. But in general, this group is not really having a direct influence on my life. And so they think, all right, they're okay, they're not harming me, non-maleficence. They kind of put them in the middle. But people who make decisions, right? Remember I said that the whole system of ethics relies on this balancing of the good against the not good, if you like. The justice system, the balancing people. The high court judges, for example, really, although they're in the legal point, they're really about that. Those people have high esteem and they're pretty close to the top, right? So justia is a very key concept that people, without knowing it, because the general public is just asked to rate these people, they rate in an ethical decision justice as really core. And down the bottom, these people here, why don't they like them? Well, they don't like them because you can see some basic things like the right to the truth. They feel that, you know, go into a car place and buy a car, you're probably going to be told a pack of lies, excuse the French, but, real estate agents, they don't trust them, okay? And that's fundamental. Trust is a fundamental idea, and it's a respect for the autonomy of the individual. Right? So the system can't operate if people are told lies, if they don't have the truth. The smooth functioning of society, that was in the middle, right? Remember in that Venn diagram I showed you, where you had law and you had ethics on and there was a little kind of region. The smooth functioning society relies on people telling each other the right things. Otherwise, you know, you really don't trust information. You can't make a contract because you're not sure the other person will stick to it, right? It's really important. Okay, so that's why these people are right down the bottom of the graph. You can go to other places. This was another poll, Gallup poll. I don't think I need to stress anymore because I've said those points. All right, so So that's a snapshot of what I just said. The public, when we look at people who are at the top of the chart, justice and beneficence, public has a high opinion of those people. People who don't follow what they have a low opinion of people who don't respect the truth and autonomy and all those things we spoke about. All right. Interestingly, and this is really important, ethics is not a static field, right? So that is that your opinion now or your opinion in one country or jurisdiction can be different from another. Okay? So this poll is in Australia that I took. Right? I showed another one, the Gallup poll, which was in America. That happened to be similar, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm going to show you an example at the end which shows you how different people, different country or different areas of the world, comparing, say, a North America and an Asia population, can have very different ideas about the balance between virtues, let's call it that. Okay? Here is an example of religion, right? Which you'd think, these people in religion, clergymen, should have a high respect. This Gallup poll, which is the US, is showing you that the rating has gone from 60% in 78 down to 40% or something like that in 2018. A roll-off, all right? So the position in society and their feeling about whether or not there's a respect for the rights of people, which is what this is about, in the same way, changes, right? And that's also important to recognize. So these things are in flux, some of these things. Okay, and if you look at engineers, the opposite, actually. 53% here in 76 goes up to 80%. But by the way, all the other professions over that period, a lot of them, like the car salesman, the people we were abusing earlier, they're all flat, all right? So certain professions, people think they're doing well. And it's not actually by chance. This movement here coincided with those professions putting in really, really rigorous rules for their people and educating their people as to what they expect them to do. And if they don't do it, they do things like take away their professional license. Right? So they enforce it very, very carefully. Okay, so that that is reflected actually in that trajectory. All right, so codes of conduct and so forth for engineers are really important. If I take, for example, the National Society of Professional Engineers in America, they break down their codes, which I kind of just spoke about just now, into principles, right, which are rather like moral principles, and then a code of practice, which is rather like our ethics ideas, right? So that's why we don't need to keep talking about these things. And then the guidelines for how you should, actually professionally act as an engineer. And these have to be formally accepted by engineers. So the professional engineer, to get the license, which is their means to practice, will have to go through this thing, pass an exam, and then if, for example, they do something wrong, a colleague, for example, there's a whistleblower or something like that, as we call it, comes along and says something wrong, there's an ethical board which, if they get pulled before the board and they don't do the right thing, their license is taken away. They can't practice, right? So that's kind of serious. All right, and there are canons for everything, right? So you've got things like, remember I talked about temperance and so forth, and discrimination. So you can't discriminate. Everybody should be treated equally. Here we go. There's a canon for it. Conflict of interest, which means doing harm. It means you act. Conflict of interest is you're acting for yourself and someone else, and you can't do that if there's a conflict, because basically, you're putting yourself or your own interests perhaps ahead of someone else's interests, and that's not what you're doing there as a professional. You should be acting in the best interest of your client. Whistleblowing, basically calling out somebody else for not adhering to things, which is part of your obligations. Safety, that you shouldn't harm somebody. You shouldn't be, you should know that when you engineer something or product or whatever, that you don't put other people in harm's way. All right. Again, I can show you these canons, which I'm showing on this figure, and show you that they all map out very nicely against the rights and wrongs that we already spoken about earlier. So the canon number on this chart, 5, etc., 1, I just spoke about public safety and so forth. You see that one, do no harm, right? Nocere, non nocere, basically sits right there, right? They all do. So you can keep on going with the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical Engineers, same sort of code. They're all the same. So you already know what the codes of ethics are, because basically those earlier slides should have taught you that we all have recognized what right and wrong is, right? And we're just formally putting them out here. But really, almost every society you look at will have the same set of rules, because they're universal. We all know that already. So the funny thing about ethics is it's built in already. Okay? All right. Just in terms of how the goals work for these societies and these professionals, basic thing is there are rules that we should do good. We respect other human beings. We shouldn't harm other human beings. We should behave in the proper way to our colleagues, to students, to employers, to clients, show some humanity, right? So you see, I'm just kind of going back over here. We should be fair, and we should have integrity. And we should tell the truth and all those things, right? And this one here, this wisdom, the idea that, we can't go making decisions for other people unless we know what we're doing. You can't build a bridge if, you only took half the course on bridge making or whatever it was, right? You need to have the knowledge and the skill to make decisions. That's an expectation. We expect the people who serve us will take the trouble and the time to do a proper job, like teaching this course on ethics, which I'm not doing. All right. All right. Outward-facing goals. We should mitigate harms, obviously, but also past harm. So we should be forward-looking, right? We should do everything to enhance the reputation of the professional and so forth. So when you look to that graph on the perception of engineers in society, it was going up, because those professions are really trying to do the best job they can, and that's an obligation. Okay? All right, I think I don't want to keep going here. So now I want to talk about, so that's about engineering, right? I'm going to talk a bit about science, conducting science. So some of you are going to go into careers maybe in research. And what are the rules there, and what should you think about? What is science all about anyway, right? So first question would be, in terms of ethics, is because it's a behavior, right? What sort of behavior? What sort of decisions should I make about my actions, right? That's what ethics is about. So if we look here in science, well, what sort of science should I conduct? What is it? I mean, is there an ethical issue about that? Question mark. Well, obviously there would be ethical issues. For example, if I was harming another creature, like an animal or something, right? There's also ethical issues in terms of access. Is it fair that I do something that someone else can't do, right? And so you think about something like big science. So big science, if you're thinking about what is it, micro society or macro society? So big science costs a lot of money, involves big teams of science, and not everybody can do it. And by putting money from a society into doing big science, and big science could be like reactors or whatever like that, they're much more expensive than other things. It means there's less money in the system. There's only so much a country earns in GDP, so it means there's only so much you can spend on research for doing science. So it means other things will be suffering. Is that a good decision for society? Is that an ethical decision? And then there's other things, like should society put its money into things which are blue sky research, things like quantum computing, which I'm involved in. Quantum computing, which now is becoming quite practical actually, but when I started it wasn't. And you'd say, well, that's never going to come to anything, never come to fruition. So why is society allowing me to do my work in this area, right? I mean, it's taking money out the public pot. It's not going to do public good, is it? But now there is potential and so forth, and that's a question, right? And then I mentioned things like how we treat other things, other people, other whatsits, right? Okay. There are all sorts of policies. I just want to kind of bring some questions to mind rather than kind of talk endlessly here, which is probably boring you stiff. So there are all sorts of institutes, government agencies, like in America. I just picked these American ones here, like the FDA, Food and Drug, about Agriculture Department, National Institute of Health, which all have guidelines about these things, but they're the same story. So I don't think I wanted to go into them, but I just point out that people have put a lot of thought into how we conduct ourselves. All right, enough of that. All right, so science. Is there a proper way that we should behave as scientists? Question mark. It's an ethical question. And so what is the norm? What's the standard by which we should do things? So that kind of goes back to Robert Morton in 1942. And he believed, and this is kind of effectively how we think now, that there are really four norms or obligations for how we should conduct ourselves in science. Universalism, that science should be independent of the people. We shouldn't judge the science by the people doing it, or when we do science, there should be no reference to people. We shouldn't discriminate. Remember we said everybody's equal. That's universalism. Communalism, that what we do as scientists, there should be no barriers. We should be giving to society, that top arrow in the first graph, right? We should openly publish our work so other people can benefit from it. We should openly share our data with other people. We should come here and we should talk, whatever, right? So the idea is communalism, that we belong to a society of people who are interested in science. And for that, we put all our knowledge there, and they benefit, and so forth. But we're responsible for what we give society. We're responsible for the quality of our workmanship. Remember I told you about this idea about knowledge? That we're expected to be professionals that run at a very, very high standard. So when we publish a paper or give someone data, we're not trying to deceive them with the stuff. We don't want to give them rubbish data. We want to give them stuff which is the best we can give them. All right? So we want to be trustworthy. And trust is really at the core of being a scientist. Okay? That you're open and trustworthy. So communalism is very important. And being disinterested in what we do. That means that we should act for the public good, not for our personal good. That's the idea of conflict of interest. Should be no conflict of interest. We're not working for ourselves as such. It's not to advance one's career, although that's very nice. But it's about actually, in the end, giving your knowledge out. The last one is skepticism. That we should always be critical of what we do, what others do, because that maintains quality and that maintains the level of inquiry in the end, in the public domain. Okay? So we should follow certain methods that are acceptable. We can't do crazy stuff. We have to be methodical, careful, repeat things we do, and follow standards. Right? So that's the idea of methodology. And it's not just methodology in terms of the science, it's also how we treat other people, even in the lab, how my graduate students are treated, how we're code of conduct, and so forth. We're expected, and we should be upright, good citizens from the social point of view as well. All right, and the norms of how we do science look like a bit crazy, but actually they follow from Karl Popper's work, very famous idea and very famous person in the philosophy of science. Karl Popper basically went through what is the method, right? I mentioned this method. What is the method? So the method is this, that we look around us and we see what other people have done and we critically examine it. It's not that we distrust it, it's that we check that it is consistent with what we do and what everyone else does and where its limits are. And from that, we try and develop a hypothesis from that. Right? So our own data and our own ideas, from that we build it on a foundation that's a reasonable foundation. Then we come up with, from the new hypothesis, we basically make predictions. Right? And we test those predictions with an experiment, and many times. And then and what we're looking to do is disprove ourselves. Not prove ourselves, but disprove ourselves. Because the minute the experiment fails, we have to come back and think about a new hypothesis. So it's really by failure, not by acceptance, that things work. And then the last step, which is really critical, is sharing it with the public world. And how do we share our ideas and get some real feedback? We do it by publishing our data. Okay? So publication is the means by which we act as the society. Remember that we said that, right back to the beginning, we're not solitary, poor human beings. We're in a society. And as scientists, we're in a society where we share with other scientists. Right? And the test, according to this thing, would be how that information we put out in a paper is accepted and how it's used, and we advance science. Right? So we have, and back, just one back is, I mentioned with our responsibilities to how we conduct science, and I mean, I was talking about methods just now, but also I mentioned about within my group, for example, there are responsibilities for how we mentor, how I talk to you, how I would talk to my graduate students, how we impart knowledge and what's the proper way to do things in terms of supervision, and trying to give other people knowledge and advance them in their careers so they can one day become professors, etc. Right? All right. Now, enough of this stuff. No, enough of values. All right. These are more about codes, and I think we've got enough of that. So, as I said, I'm a chief editor of a journal, and what I want to talk to you about is this last piece of putting out information to the public, because that really is where ethics hits the road. Right? So, why publish? We publish because, and this is George Whiteside down here, this is his paper, Robert Merton, I'm just again quoting this Robert Merton chap. We publish because, as George Whiteside, a very famous chemist, said, if we didn't, no one would see it, and we haven't fulfilled our obligation to society, right? All right, so if you think about the principles under Merton, well, we don't have to talk about universalism because it doesn't really kind of apply there, but communalism does, that we need to make our information, we need to share our information, and it has to be trustworthy, and we have a duty, if you put it in terms of Kant, right? In terms of deontology, remember that second ethical principle? We have a duty, actually, to disseminate our work and share it. That's one of our duties as scientists. Being disinterested. We have to benefit, it is for the benefit of the community. It's the only way we can benefit the community, because that is the mechanism we have in place. And the last point about skepticism is where, as I said, it really comes into play. And I'm going to talk about the community's role in validating the quality before something goes out, because you don't want to publish rubbish, because then someone spends years and years working to reproduce your results, which you know are actually of no value, right? So it's really more than a disrespect to your community, right? It's actually doing damage to your community, which we know is one of the things you're not supposed to do, right? All right, so how do we, this last one, how does the community get involved in validating? And this is what this figure's about. So what happens is, I'm the editor of this journal, and authors basically submit their work to the journal. So I then get reviewers outside who are experts in the field. That's called peer review. Peers of the people we're talking about come along and to critically evaluate the work. And if that's passed, right, so that's the organized skepticism, if you like, that's the reviewer's role. the fact that we're putting the work in there in the first place is already satisfying communalism and disinterestedness, so that's great. And once you've satisfied, that the journal's satisfied that the work is worthy of the public, it can do public good, then it's disseminated. It's published, it's printed, it's put on the internet and so forth, right? And that becomes then the property of the community. So it's this three-way team effort between the authors who conduct the work, between the reviewers who help maintain quality, and the community that benefit effectively, and the journal as the intermediary to make this contribution. Right? All right. Now, not everybody is actually doing a proper job here, and there are many things that happen. And what I want to talk about is misconduct, which is really being unethical. Right? What happens? How does that happen with this last step, which is the most damage you can do to this community, right? Three things you can do. You can either fabricate data. So my colleague the other day was talking about Sean from Bell Labs, who basically completely fabricated data and did an immense damage to the community. You can falsify data, right? Or you can plagiarize. Right? Plagiarize means steal, basically, right? So you can see why those are unethical, because they all go back to that table of values I told you about. Plagiarize means that, you, for example, take something from the internet, you stick it in there or whatever, or you steal from someone else's paper without asking them. Right? Stealing is taking without asking. And so let me just kind of talk about the man with the puppet first before we get to this. I like the man with the puppet. He's very nice. All right, I don't suppose any of you know about Fred Rogers, but when my kids were growing up, he was a feature, and he's actually a very, very famous character, North American television. As for children's TV educator. There's actually a film that just came out, and there's now a newspaper article that just came out a week ago or so. There's a documentary on him, Won't You Be My Neighbor, blah, blah. Why? Well, this chap was considered the gold standard in ethical behavior. He's passed away now. And was teaching kids values and so forth. So he actually was invited to a commencement address, when the students graduate at this college. And I just put this here that, you can get all sorts of prizes and honors and whatever, but in life, the best thing, the most important thing in life is if people trust you and don't fear the truth. And believe it or not, that really is at the heart of misconduct in scientific, but it's actually at the heart of ethics, actually, which is kind of why it's very interesting, because all the things I spoke to you about earlier in terms of behavior, that actually is the core, right? So I thought it was very funny. The man with the puppet actually knows what he's talking about. Anyway, so sorry about that. All right, so moving on. This is, I'm quoting you here from an article. How are we doing on time, by the way? No idea. I'm sort of on Toronto time, so let me just quickly check. I'm doing 44. How long what time, how many more minutes do we have? Anybody? We're good? All right, good. Just tell me when we're sort of about 10 minutes off or something, just kind of tell me. I don't want to sort of take all your time, sorry. All right, so this is an article from Science, a very, very famous journal, where they were looking at misconduct and all those people I told you doing like falsification, plagiarism, blah, blah, blah. And what you see actually, sadly, is, just don't look at the details here. This graph, and the reason it's kind of beyond this period, what happens with data collection is that with scientific data collection, it's sort of always off some years in terms of getting all the data for these things. Anyway, main point, it's blooming exponentially. There's really a lot of plagiarism, a lot of misconduct happening out there, which is really sad. Okay? Now you might say, well, are the number of scientists the same? No, actually, there's the population of people publishing the number of journals is actually going up too. But nonetheless, it's kind of a bit alarming, right? And the main point in this next slide I want to show you is, yes, there's a lot of data, but it actually tends to be in the hands of few authors. So a few authors are, in the terms of criminal law, repeat offenders. A few authors are doing a lot more than they should. It's not that every report of misconduct is one scientist. It's that one scientist is doing multiple misconducts and they're adding up. Okay? So there are individuals that are actually nasty pieces of work. Anyway, not good. And here's an example from the same report in Nature, in Science. And you can see, particularly, there's Henrik Schön, who was the topic of my colleague's talk that I was sitting in on, who had 32 cases of misconduct, right? So not very good. But there are now, actually, Yoshitaka Fuji, I mean, he's up there 170. That's pretty bad. And it takes time to catch these people in some sense, because the expectation is you're doing the right thing, right? Not that you're doing the wrong thing generally. So it takes a whistleblower, somebody that says, wait a minute, something's wrong with this data. It's the same data in both papers and it's a completely different thing. What's going on, question mark, right? It takes a bit of time to catch up. And also, it's back to this thing I mentioned to you earlier with the polls. That, you know, when you poll people and you ask them the question about what do you think about this particular ethical behavior, they may weight one type of behavior differently in one jurisdiction to another. You know, Southeast Asia compared to wherever, Europe or something, right? So, and that's what's kind of shown here too, that certain jurisdictions, you know, feel it's acceptable to do something more than others, for example, right? Well, we'll see that there are variances between what different societies believe. There's actually, what has helped this area is the fact that there are databases now. This is called Retraction Database. And you can plug into this database, you can plug in a person, and you can see the history, because if they're a repeat offender, then you go in there and you're going to suddenly see, wait a minute, I was suspicious about this paper, but suddenly look, there's a history here from this chap that's really long, right? So you can go in there and you can actually, it helps to bring to the fore a problem. So, for example, you know, I'm on this, I've misspelt Isaac. This stands for International Scientific Advisory Council of MASIS. So I'm on this committee, and these are all my fellow members of this committee. And I thought I'd make a joke and show you that the universities we come from, I'm from Toronto, University of Toronto, and Harry and Lindsay are from Cambridge. And it doesn't matter where we come from, but you can see that actually our universities, which are great universities, you know, and you can see how many faculty we have. There's Toronto with its number of faculty and whatever research funds. However you look at it, there's still, wherever you look, where humanity is humanity, there's still a probability that people are going to be unethical, right? And there they are. So that was the kind of the joke that, you know, I'm not immune from it, or my university's not immune from it, whatever, right? I mean, there's how many people? 14,000 professors. I'm one of those. So I mean, I guess you've got some odds there, right? All right. So as I said, I'm a chief editor of a journal. And I'll just show you how this thing works with when you get unethical behavior. So here I get this email, and it says to me, Harry, there's something fishy going on, basically, from the production assistant people who've looked at the paper. And why do they red flag? Why do they tell me there's something wrong? How do they, right? And so this is the paper. I've taken the author thing off it, so you shouldn't be able to see any author, so you don't know who it is. But this manuscript comes to us, and nowadays, computer software is amazing. It can go through a paper, and what it does is it highlights the passages where there's something suspect. It's either been, you know, they've either found it somewhere else, or there's a high probability that those words in that sequence, whatever. So very quickly you can see this paper clearly could be plagiarism, right? I mean, clearly these blocks of text, like, and then there's double red means, you know, absolutely word for word, this text has been seen elsewhere, right? Clear case. So that's unethical, right? Obviously. So you can see how there are tools which help to mitigate and manage what we're looking at nowadays. All right. And you know, there's this issue about being disinterested in what you do. So, like, here's a reviewer. You know, you can never always be sure that this peer reviewer who's an expert in the area, that's maybe a problem, right? Because you're an expert in the area means, oh, this is lovely work. I wish I could use that for myself, hum, 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 right? Could speed up my own thing. No. So that's, you know, you can get things like that, and that can be traced, right, by effectively looking at what you're looking at. So there's tools out there to do that. All right, enough of that. Last topic now, is about the corporate perspective and ethics, right? And you'd say to yourself, well, that seems like a ridiculous topic to talk about to you chaps, because, I mean, corporations have nothing to do, there's no reason for them to be ethical, you'd think. I mean, what are they about? They're about making money. They're not about being nice to people, right? However, this is taken from, again, a couple of weeks ago, right? New York Times article which has this, I took the figure off here, and you can see chief executives and members of the round table, which is basically looking at what is the role of companies. What should companies do in terms of their social responsibilities? And it's a huge, big thing. These are the CEOs of some of America's top companies, right? Like Tim Cook and so forth from Apple and people like that, and General Motors and BlackRock, one of the biggest equity fund partners in the US, right? All right, so what is the purpose of companies? Don't have to read all these words, but the shareholder value, what does that mean? It means that really you want to give back to the people who hold your shares the most value. They want their shares to go up as much as possible, which means as long as your company makes as much as possible, in some relationship, you're going to make more money, right? Those are the shareholders, the people who hold a little piece of the company. So generally, you want to make as much money as possible. That should satisfy the shareholders. But what about the stakeholders? What do I mean by stakeholders? So stakeholders are people that are affected by the actions of the company. They can be the shareholders. They can be customers, suppliers. So, Starbucks coffee, they have all these people supplying them coffee. And do they have any obligation to be ethical with respect to that? Do they have to make sure those people get a fair wage, that you're not doing damage to their local resources around them, etc.? Of course you do, right? So the suppliers, your own employees, you have to have ethical standards with respect to government, local community, media, etc. There's all sorts of social issues about being a company, and those have costs, or utility in the words that were used earlier, right? There's a utility associated with a company operating, and you should recognize it. So the question really is not what are these things, but the question is what is the correct balance? Remember the original breaking figure I had with the arrow going up, the arrow going down, and justice in the middle. The justice in the middle was trying to say what's the right balance between beneficence, if you like, and no damage, bottom line. Okay? Same idea. So what is the balance between shareholder value and stakeholder needs? How should we prioritize that? How should we give preference to that, right? Okay, so this is to put it in perspective. So back in 2002, when really the subject hadn't really started to be thought about, that there is a social obligation of companies, an ethical responsibility. Time magazine actually ran its Person of the Year on the cover with these three ladies who were the whistleblowers that brought down, for example, Enron. We all know about the Enron disaster, right? With the housing crisis that really basically, by 2008, kind of killed everyone, right? So whistleblowers are the mechanism by which we maintain ethical standards in an organization. They're, if you like, the feedback loop that keeps everything honest. So it's really telling that even in that time, people recognized that there is a responsibility for these people in these companies. So corporate conduct, three things, right? Because we're talking about behavior. That's what ethics is, behavior. Three elements to behavior that we have to think about in terms of decision-making, ethical decision-making. What are the values of the individual? Right? So values, right? Values being, you're thinking right back to Aristotle here in this talk. What about managers and co-workers and their influence they put on you to make decisions that you don't agree with? It still falls into this thing, right? And last, what is the opportunity? Can I get away with it? And what will happen if I don't get away with it, if you like? What's the balance between the utility in that case, right? And that will determine whether you make an ethical or an unethical choice. So that's kind of roughly the little block diagram of that thing. So I think I'm just going to skip over this thing right now. So the issues of what is, I mentioned this idea about with time things change, right? I mentioned that earlier with the idea that engineers have become sort of more upright citizens in the view of society and so forth. Same thing here. The key issues about what ethics should look at in corporations have changed with time too. Right? So today, I mentioned privacy. Remember I said one of our rights is the right to privacy. There it is. Privacy is a big issue. Why? IP. People are concerned about the security of information and IP, intellectual property theft, etc., like that. Sustainable development, not doing damage to the environment and around. That's the common good. Remember this thing I talked about? You've got to do the common good, right? So all of those things you can see are current issues, if you like, right now. And some things you don't trust the companies to monitor for themselves, right? So being auditable and accountable to yourself, people, after Enron, people realized that you just can't trust the companies to do it. So if you want to be listed on the stock exchange, like we're on the New York Stock Exchange, then you have to follow the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX as it's called, which basically means you have to follow rules. So ethics and law kind of come together again in that particular case. All right. So you've got responsibilities, as we said. You've got to the stockholders, if you like, profit, return on investment. You've got to the employees. You've got to provide a safe workplace. Remember, do no harm. You've got to compensate, which means have a respect for those people and be fair, treat everybody equally, not discriminate, etc. To the public, you've got to respect the people you sell to. Right? You can't do harm to them. You can't sell someone a coffee which is laced with arsenic or something. I mean, you've got to be trustworthy in the product you sell. To society, you can't very well belch out noxious fumes that you know will cause cancer to somebody. Right? All right, and so forth. All right. I think that's enough of that. Let me just literally the last. If you look here, this is the very last. Economist in the August Economist, again, asks this question, what are companies for? Right? So this is really this whole issue about corporate social responsibility. I'm a company, I'm here to help. Right? I'm not here to take money from you, I'm here to give. Right? The two arrows on the diagram, it's now become part of culture, of the culture. Right? Literally today, 2 weeks ago, whatever this was. All right, so in a very big picture view, so you understand it when you go out there into industry or wherever. The idea is the company has these three-way triple bottom line, as it's called. It's responsible to its stockholders to make a profit. It's responsible socially for the well-being of the people in the company, for the well-being of society. It's fair trade, as we say, and its investment in the community. So, for example, Amazon in Toronto right now is not just building its housing, but it's actually building affordable housing around it, which will be future workers, etc. You're thinking about this whole cycle, if you like. Environmental is obvious, we've spoken about that, and carbon footprint and waste. All right. So corporate responsibility is this big thing which kind of companies are trying to work up the chain from, in the past, just thinking about their own pockets, all the way to this discretionary area, which is non-legislated, right? So the SOX Act I talked about is legislated, that's legal. We moved right away from that. So who's responsible in a company? Who's the last word in all this stuff? And who decides how the companies operate? Well, the CEO and the CFO, the people at the top, the key executives, they have to actually instill these beliefs in the organization. They set what is the code of ethics. They tell you what those values are. And the board of governors, someone like myself, who's on the board, is responsible for making sure that the management of the company, who responds to me, will tell me, yes, we've done that, and have proper mechanisms in place. And the board can then go to the public, the stakeholders, and the press, and whatever, and say, this is how we operate, and it's transparent, and that's how things go. All right, so I think that's enough of that. So, and we talked about this idea about the social contract. It's evolving. I think it's enough of that. All right, and let me just say, so companies develop codes, right, to describe how they behave, the way I just explained it. I think I picked up Texas Instruments as an example for you. I'm going to show you kind of our stuff, but Texas Instruments is very interesting because they really boiled down ethics in terms of the decision-making to a very few simple questions, and this is really nice. So the first question is, where are we? Have we gone beyond ethics into the legal-illegal boundary that I talked about? The first question is the action legal, right? So that's interesting. So at least if it's legal, you're okay, but it may be unethical. That's another question, right? Then the next thing is, does it comply with our values? Well, we said what our values are, so is it ethical, right? That's another way of saying it. Can anyone tell me what do you feel bad means? I talked to you previously about it. What do you think that word, what was the word I used to describe do you feel bad? Pretty close. Same thing. It's integrity. So the wholeness thing, that it's the idea that we had all these values, and if we feel it's going against our own personal values, right, then we don't feel good, right? So you feel bad because really this is not something that someone with integrity would do. How would it look in the newspaper? Means really, from a societal point of view, looking in, just like I showed you those polls, that's not right, right? So it's not right for me, it's not right for everybody, right? Universalism. We spoke about that. All right, and if it's wrong, because you know it's wrong anyway, don't do it, right? And it's kind of really good, actually. I mean, I thought it's kind of pretty straightforward. So, I gave you some complicated ways. I called them 3 tests, right? I'm going to apply the 3 tests in a minute. But really, those questions are a very, very good way of doing the testing. Motorola, same thing. How do you this is just about mechanistically how you develop these tests. So I think we've said enough on this stuff. Oh, one last thing is that the KPMG are actually the advisors to this university, and they're a kind of an accounting firm, in case you're not aware, and they actually themselves they developed a process which is like, how do you make ethical decisions in companies, and they call it the ethical thermometer under these components. But again, I don't think that's particularly pertinent. You've already got the principles, and I don't need to keep talking about them. And you can actually kind of, in the corporate environment, you can weigh these things up, and you can make a graph, a spider chart like that, and you could kind of decide how well things are looking from a corporation. Basically, the main point is you come up with a code, and it should be transparent. The public, who are your partners in this thing, stakeholders, should be able to look and see, what are your standards? Right? So this is from the company I work with, Canadian Solar, and all the documents are out there, including whistleblowers. When people, how does that work? Code of business, conduct, and ethics. It's up there. Everybody can see it. They know what your standard. That's one of the first things that people want to know is, how do you operate? I mentioned this side of engineers. How do you operate? It's how you operate. Right? You put it up there. You let people look at it. They decide, whatever. All right, and then you can see that this is just the components of how you think about how you operate. So how well back to the idea of getting polls, right? How well do we do in this thing? And you can look, and the public's view of where business is running well, this transparency is considered to be good, and where it's bad, you can see that, there's room to play, if you like, in certain parts of the world. I can look in sort of like place like there, whatever, pretty bad. People are not very happy with how ethical conduct, right? So there's room to go, and you can see and these are, in a way, it's an interesting map because, culturally, maybe that's an acceptable thing or whatever, who knows, right? All right, so I just want to now talk a bit about a couple of, how much time do I have? How many minutes do I have, anybody? I have how many, sorry? 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, and when are we supposed to end? 20? 30. Perfect. Oh, so it's time for lots of questions and talk. Good. Thank you very much. Sorry. Appreciate it. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I want to talk about a few case studies, right? Like, how do we think, this has all been very theoretical and abstract. Okay? So what I want to do now is see if you can think about how to make a decision, right? So I'm going to remind you again that we distilled ethical decision-making into 3 tests. We had the deontology, the duty ethics of Kant, coming down to the generalization test, which spoke about 2 things. It spoke about rights, these kind of rights, and consistency. The fact we can apply our ideas to everybody, and it'll work, if you like, and it will work universally. We talked about utilitarian ethics and the utilitarian test at the best utility. And the last one we spoke about is virtue ethics, which came to 3 pieces. That we feel good about ourselves. Integrity in our values. Remember, I spoke about that just a few minutes ago. Common good. We're not going to pollute the environment, etc. Spoke about that. Justice. That we're not discriminating, that we're treating everybody and everything equally. Okay? All right. So here goes with the first case, hypothetical case. I made this young lady who's called Tatiana. I don't know why I called her Tatiana. And here she is, and she's a top student in Missis. So a few years' time, 3 years' time for you guys, you're going to be, one of you is Tatiana. And you're really, really, well-educated. You're a top student here, right? In environmentally sound technologies. last semester, and you've gone out, interviews, and you did very well in your interviews, and you heard about some great job, smashing job, at Rosneft Oil. So I hope I picked the right place. Rosneft Oil. And you wanted to stay in Moscow, and so this is brilliant. I mean, there's all these advancement opportunities for you, and the job has really got rich potential in terms of, you can see you're going to use all this knowledge you've learned here from Assis over those 4 years, and it's going to be wonderful. And also the people seem very nice, and you've heard great things about the company. So you really want to work there, and plus it's in Moscow, and it's in a great part of Moscow, so you can imagine you're going to have lovely lifestyle, really enjoy the city and so forth. So you're dead keen, Tatiana's dead keen, and she's got the right skill set, and Rosneft themselves have offered her the job. They think she's smashing. They think she's really cat's whiskers, as we say, just what they want. All right, great. So right after her interview, she's been offered the job. A new CEO, corporate, chief executive officer of Rosneft, comes in. He's installed. There was a change in the upper management of the company, and been looking over the books, as it were, and realized there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of problems with the company, and decides the first thing that this new CEO is going to do is put a freeze on all spending, effectively, all hiring, till effectively he's got to the bottom of what's going on in the company. And that happens. And so Rosneft suddenly realized, with the person in HR, human resources, who's offered Tatiana the job, said, I'm sorry, I didn't send you the letter, the official contract letter, because I can't offer you the job right now till this hiring freeze is over. I'm not sure it's going to be how long it's going to be, but once the hiring freeze has gone, then we can offer you the job. All right, so that's the first piece of information for you to kind of digest, right? So remember how a contract works. It's offer and acceptance, right? All right, so here we are, and we've got the second point, really, in the story, which is, in the meantime, Tatiana gets a job offer. She thinks, well, I better kind of go in some more interviews, because this is getting a bit dodgy. I might or might not get my job at Rosneft, and I'm getting a bit worried, so I better do some insurance here and go for another job interview. So she goes off, and she's interviewed again in Moscow, actually, which is nice, but it's Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel, MMK, big company, which is in Ufa, in eastern Russia. She's a bit kind of apprehensive about going there, but and also the job is not exactly what she wanted. She's not sure that all the things she's learned are going to be as useful as she'd hoped with the other job, but nonetheless, it's a good, solid job. It's a big company, and she can see building a life. It doesn't have the social advantages she would have hoped for in a private life in Moscow, but it's pretty good. So, and meanwhile, all her friends in her little friends group are getting offers, and in particular, her best friend Anna has got this been bragging about this smashing job she's got, a marvelous job offer, and sort of rubbing up Tatiana the wrong way. She's saying, oh, great, Anna's got this brilliant job. What about me? Anyway, and to make matters worse, Tatiana's parents are putting pressure on her, saying, look at all the sacrifices we made to pay your tuition here at Missis. What a rotten old egg you are. You're not taking this brilliant job at MMK. What's wrong with it? So what does she do? She caves. She signs the contract at MMK. Signs the contract, right? Accepts it's been offered, she accepts it. Okay? All right. So what happens? This is what's the ethical issue? You'll see now where the ethical issue comes in. 2 weeks later, she's sitting there munching on her sandwiches, and gets a call, on her cell phone. This is Rosneft HR. We're hiring again. Great news. Come over here. I've prepared the contract, the employment contract for you. Come over and sign up with us. We're so pleased. This freeze is over, and you can work with us. How lovely. Now, obviously, Tatiana has a bit of a dilemma here, right? Okay, she's already signed a contract with MMK. And yet she really wants that job, and Anna, her best friend, who's already piled on the pressure and made her feel rotten in the first place, she says, don't worry about it. What are they going to do? They're not going to chase you from the Urals or wherever they were. So, they're not, you're fine. Take this great job and launch your career the way you wanted to do it. So what should she do? Question mark. All right, so now I take it over to you chaps. Use the decision-making, all the principles of ethical decision-making. How should, let's kind of go around. What do you think she should do, everybody? Let's put our hands up first. Do you think she should she take the job with MMK, or should she sign up with Ross? What should she do? Who would break her contract effectively with MMK? Hands up. Oh, nobody, right? Oh, good. A couple of you, good. I feel better. All right, that's getting better, 10%, all right? So why? Who would like to volunteer why? There's no, with ethical decision making, the first thing you know is that it's always an issue of balancing, right? It's always an issue of balancing. In the end, you could, so let me kind of go right back to the beginning before I criticize anybody. So feel free to say something. I'll tell you why. Because basic principle, remember, is free will. That everybody in the society is able to make a decision. They've got the ability to make decisions. And as a rational human being, right, it's what separates us kind of from the animals. And as long as it's a reasoned argument, right, that's the key point, then it can have validity in terms of balancing, if you like, all of the values that are important. Okay, so who's going to try and I'll tell you what I mean by that when we start to talk about this in a second. So who would like to start by saying why you think she should break the contract? Just any reason. Anybody had a reason that they'd like to volunteer? Nobody. See, I put you to sleep, that's the problem. Too shy, I know, it's ridiculous. I mean, I really wouldn't be, believe me, I wouldn't be offended. It'd take a lot to offend me. So I'm happy to listen. No? All right, let's go the other way. So 90% of you felt that she should not break the contract. She should go to MMK and take the job in the Urals. So what was the basis, right? Because that's where we're asking. It's not, good, bad. It's what's the basis for the behavior that you think she should do. Who would like to volunteer that?
Probably she would better get some experience, and then she can change the contract.
Excellent. All right. So that's a really good argument. Why is that a good argument? So what is experience? What does experience mean in terms of the ethical theory I just talked to you about?
We didn't hear it.
Oh, excuse me. So the lady made a very good point. She said, I'll just take the first point of yours, which is that Tatiana would gain very valuable experience, right? And that she could then advance herself and I guess then later go back to another job. So what is experience in the ethical decision making was my question. So it was
She can take experience in both companies, but the
good.
important thing here is that she should make decisions herself. Not
Yes.
listen to her parents
Sure.
or her friends.
That's good too, but the thing, I'll tell you where I'm going with this. You're right. That's absolutely true. It is supposed to be free will. It's supposed to be her decision, so you're correct. That's the first thing about virtue, is that it's actually, if you go back to Aristotle, it's about your values, because in the end you're trying to be your better person, right? But where I was going was actually a second point, which is called utilitarianism, which is which one of these decisions has the best utility, right? Do you understand? Who'd like me to repeat that? So which decision, why did I say I like that? I said, there's a utilitarian argument. What does that mean?
Doing good for society,
Yeah, good for her. She's got a job. She can benefit the company maybe in some way. It's good for society. The company has more productivity or something. She can contribute in some way. So certainly you could make an argument about benefits and costs for her activity. That's a reason in ethics for doing something. Okay? All right, so you kind of get the idea that you can start. There are all different reasons, and the gentleman's reason was very good. Integrity actually is what you're talking about, right? So they're all different, and there can be conflicts. right? Utility, which one do I take? Does utility trump virtue? I don't know, right? So you have to so any case of ethical decision making is actually a balance between various constraints and reasoning them. And that's why ethics is a subject which relates to, of course, interpersonal relations, but it's a rational, right? And that's what Kant said. It's a rational thing, which in the end you hope will apply to everybody. Okay? So let me tell you, I did a really painful thing over here where I kind of went through each test of ethics and tried to apply it to Tatiana's case to give you an idea how you might argue from different perspectives. Okay? So again, if I'm doing too much and your faces just drop, like, what the hell are you doing? It's too late now, I guess. All right. So let's start with the generalization test, which remember came from Kant, which means you need a consistent rationale. That it means that you expect everybody with the same rationale will behave the same way. Right? That's the expectation. And the other part of it, of course, is that it should satisfy certain basic things, like, right to the truth, right to no harm, and right to what is agreed. So I kind of put that one in bold, because you can see, first of all, that breaking a contract, right, with the first place is really not respecting a right to what you had agreed. Right? A contract is a right. Right? And so let's start with those. All right, so what is Tadia? She wants to break her contract with MMK. That's the action, right? So it's a behavior, right? Ethics is about behavior, about actions. So that's the action we're proposing. And what's the rationale for it, right? That's, you always ask, why? Why does she want to do that? She wants it because in her mind, because it's always from the person's centric, right? It's egocentric, it's a better job, she thinks. All right, so that's why. All right, so let's apply the generalization test. So if everybody who wanted a better job would break their contract with society, then it would become a universal practice. That's what this says here, right? That's the categorical imperative, as Kant called it. Everybody would do the same thing. It means that any time a company gave you a promise, remember this word trust that I spoke about with the man with the puppet? Yeah, so you wouldn't trust anybody, right? Every time someone gave a contract, no one would trust that it's reliable, and you'd always be going off to other companies because you thought, they might break the contract, I may break the contract, and this whole issue of contract law, of contract anything actually, whether it's going into a shop buying something, you undermine the principle of exchange, right? Of material exchange. It's really a fundamental principle. So you can see that's a bit problematic, right? So breaking contracts whenever you like would defeat the whole purpose of contracts. There wouldn't be employment contracts anymore. She'd go, for example, she could go on her first day of work to Rosneft and they'd say, I was just joking about this contract. There's no job. What are you talking about? Right? If it were universal practice. That's kind of taking it to the extreme. So the idea about universalism is to take an argument to its extreme. And it would mean that the job market, which is the economy, which relies on it in some sense, you would undermine the job market. So the generalization test would be failed. There'd be no coherent rationalization, coherent reason for that action, the proposed action of the individual. How about utilitarianism, which we kind of just spoke about a minute ago? So Tatiana could argue, and I just mentioned that she wouldn't be fully motivated at MMK. She wouldn't feel that she's being tested to her strength. She wouldn't do a good job for them. The company won't be better off. There'll be a lower utility, if you like. Whereas if she moved, so if you went to the other case, Rosneft, excuse me, she'd do much more for the company. She'd benefit the company. They would benefit society. So at Rosneft, she's doing she's giving much better utility than if she were at MMK. So the utilitarian test is passed, but of course we kind of failed because in a sense the generalization test was failed. Let's talk about virtue ethics. So 3 components: integrity. We spoke about integrity. The gentleman here actually brought up integrity. Common good and justice. So Tatiana could argue that going to Rosneft, she's going to learn more, improve herself, which is what the gentleman said, right? Basically. It's going to make her a better person, right? It's going to make her happier. Remember we said the ultimate aim is essentially this balance in which people attain this eudaimonia, this happiness, right? So the whole point of the exercise would be lost in some sense personally. but she is going back on her word, right? So in some sense, part of the integrity, she's losing her own integrity, and a violation of that, which is her honor. All right, so she kind of, some virtues she'd pass, but there's a conflict in there, right? So overall, she fails the generalization test. She does kind of argue she adds some utility, but certainly there's a problem with virtue. So overall, we would say that it's a bit suspect, her decision, and she would not feel good about making it, because if you looked at the big picture, she's really not satisfying these ethical tests very strongly. Okay? Yeah. Question from the top.
5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. Thank you. I appreciate. All right. I got one last thing to talk about. All right. One last example for you, which to pain you less. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. I appreciate. All right. So this is something which was an article published in Nature, 2018. So quite recent. And it's called The Moral Machine. What was the title? Yeah, The Moral Machine Experiment, where they went away and they set up an internet thing which actually got 40 million responses of visitors to this site on a simple but really profound ethical question, which is, you're imagining an autonomous vehicle. There's, what's it called, Kasmorsk? There's a lorry company here in Russia that makes self-driving lorries that go up to the far north for mineral processing and so forth. So anyway, but there's many companies like Google and so forth who are making self-driving cars. We all know about self-driving cars, all right? Oh, Kamask, thank you. Very good, I got a feed. All right, Kamask trucks, brilliant. All right, so the idea here is you've got the self-driving lorry from Kamask, and there's 3 chaps on board, and at the red light here, red pedestrian light, some pedestrians are crossing. So you could say they're kind of breaking the law in the sense they're crossing a red light. And the self-driving car has a decision to make. Does it go straight on, or does it swerve to the right? If it goes straight on, it whacks these 3 poor pedestrians and kills them. If it goes to the right, it saves the 3 pedestrians and kills the 3 passengers in the car. All right? So that's the basic question. And of course, all these 40 million people from all over the world participated in trying to understand how they would think about this problem without the benefit, of course, of our famous triple ethical tests, right? Okay. All right. And so the global preferences for how this machine should be programmed to behave are shown here in this figure. And I'll roughly, just to simplify what you have to think about, tell you about, oh, sorry, this thing's gone funny on me. All right, these are the graphs, bar charts, which you should look at, and these are the actions. So the actions, preferred actions, are firstly inaction, which means the car just keeps going straight and whacks the 3 people crossing the road, as opposed to swerves, which seems to have a very low respondence rate, all the way to, let's look at a few things like sparing more characters. So if you spared more people than less people, would that be preferred? And you can see that one really has a strong response. Everybody agrees you should do that. And also they agree sparing people over sparing pets. If pets were crossing over across the road, well, you should do that. But they also, interestingly, show things like, let's have a look, and sparing large compared to sparing fit. So if someone's, excuse me for bad language, but someone's thin or whatever and someone's quite fat, you should kill the fat person, they're saying. Right? That's what they're kind of saying. They're saying that. That's okay. Kill the fat one over the thin one. All right? And they're saying that, the fact there was a traffic light that was red, that's not good. They crossed on the red light, and so that one's got a pretty high response rate. So that's a good excuse for killing them. All right? So there's your bar chart of data. And what's even more interesting is these responses. You can look in the regions, Western Hemisphere, Eastern, and Southern. And you can see if we look at those questions they have really different ideas about what are the ethical choices you should make. All right. So I've got I guess with the 5 minutes left, I suppose what I should just do is go through it, or do I want to, let me ask you, based on what we've spoken about, pick a test and tell me what the answer should be. what's an easy test? Let's pick the utilitarian test. So what's the answer of what action? That one automatically tells us what we should do. Well, it would tell us that we should spare more people than less, right? Because we're assuming that people are a benefit to society. That would be one thing. All right. What about the idea of different types of people? Is there anything we've learned about different types of people in society? What did we learn is the thing that on that diagram, the top and the bottom, where they came together, what was the point of the exercise? The balance. Who was at the helm of decision making? Justice. What's the principle of justice? Is what, sorry? Is quote? Is what? Equality, yeah. Equality, sorry, equality, I didn't hear it. 100% equality. Everybody should be treated equally. We shouldn't discriminate. Just because you're fat or just because you're younger or older, people in society, by justice, should be treated equally, right? All right, so let's go through, and yet, the respondents thought differently, right? Kind of really interesting. So sometimes you get surprised. So let's go through a few things. Staying on course or not? Before you read all that stuff, let's see, don't read it, everybody. Should we stay on course or should we swerve? What's the point before you're all reading it? No? All right, I'll tell you the answer. We should, if we swerve the car, we've taken a conscious decision to kill someone. So by not swerving, we're effectively not making that decision. Because both decisions are killing people, but it's the action which is important. Okay? So, staying on course will result in the death of two elderly, one woman. We've already said that people are equal. So there's three people there. Staying on course is not making the decision to avoid these people. So in terms of the generalization test, we're okay. All right? So basically, we shouldn't make a decision to kill people. We know that killing people is wrong, right? So that's the first thing. The virtue test is in terms of, we said, the common good, right? So safety obviously is a common good, and so forth. So we wouldn't respect that. Okay, utility test. 3 people killed, 3 people alive, 3 people dead. Net utility, sadly, is 0, right? So there's no utility test here. But the fact that this generalization test is failed at the beginning is the key point, right? Swerving to avoid pedestrian, well, that's obvious. It's the same thing in reverse. We've already spoken about saving more lives. We've already said about the fact we shouldn't discriminate, which is this one over here, by age, sex, societal status. Obviously, lawfulness shouldn't provide a preference. And by species, the laws of ethics we've spoken about to this point are principally about human interactions. However, there are laws about ethical treatment of animals, etc., but they don't apply here. So basically, that's an immaterial argument. All right, I've mentioned different parts of the world. I'll do my last slide since we're running out of time here. Last slide is the social contract is based upon acceptable ethical moral principles. That forms a civil society. We have certain rules, which we call ethical rules, which I spoke about. All right, thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions? If there's 0 time for one question? Yeah. Thank you for being a good timekeeper.
I just wonder,
yeah.
how long have you been in Russia?
Yes.
And is this your first time?
No. So I've been serving on the ISAC, the International Scientific Advisory Council now, for 4 years, 4 or 5 years, I've forgotten how many years. So this is and we meet twice a year. I come to Moscow to meet here. So this is I guess if it's 10, it's 5 times, it's 10 times. Thank you. And I love it, it's great. Yeah. No other questions? All right. If not, thank you so much for your attention. It was a pleasure. Thank you.